Like when we go to school, for example, what you should be learning is how do you negotiate your pay at work, like investments, smart investments, all of these things. What does risk look like? Why is it important to vote? Like real life things that you're gonna need. And it's almost like you get to the age of 20 and you haven't learned none of that, and then you're having to learn it all. I think one of the problems we have in politics now is it's very reactive. I think we've got a lot of leaders now that kind of react to day-to-day social media, tweets and just public pressure. Like they're scared to make decisions. So I think for me it's like exactly that. It comes from a point of sort of feeling neglected as a child.
Okay.
Like feeling like your voice don't matter, like feeling powerless, like when things around you were happening and you had no control, or you felt like no one really cared about what you thought. Like for me, my youth club was more than just a youth club. It was basically my second home, because my mum used to work, and when she used to work, I used to go to school, and then from 4 o'clock to 9 o'clock, I'll spend the time at youth club, and then they'll pick me up and take me home, and I'll do that every single day for like 10 years of my life. So when my youth club got shut, I just couldn't understand why no one had cared about the fact that this, this space that was a place for so many local people that existed for 30 years, no one cared about why it was shutting down. No one tried to stop it. No one thought about the alternatives for the young people in the area. So I just felt like, you know what, you can either sit and complain about these things, or, I'm going to get involved and I'm going to try to be a voice for people, as I say, like who look and sound like me. There's so many issues that are impacting young people, and they need a voice, because, everything that we decide now is going to impact their future generations.
So we're here with Mete from MyLifeMySay, but also now a cabinet member in Hackney Council. But I also could say that Mete is a companion, a colleague who I've been fortunate enough to work with on a whole bunch of different sort of things over the years. I think must have met like 10 years ago or something.
10 years ago, yeah, man. Vol was a different place.
Yeah. I'm really glad to have you here on this sofa to talk about kind of your career, the kinds of things you've done over the last few years, and also the kind of lessons you've learned. But first off, it'd be great to learn a bit about yourself and who you are and where you're from.
Yeah, so my name is Mete, as you introduced me, and I got 3 different hats on, but I guess, the way I always introduce myself is, I'm still that young kid from Hackney who just has aspirations and sort of, the desire to want to change the world for people who look and sound like people like me and you. And I know that like we've known each other for years, and that's something that we've been passionate doing. But yeah, in my day job, I run a charity called MyLifeMySay, which is all about trying to encourage young people to participate in democracy. And then also I'm a councillor and cabinet member trying to really lead Hackney's role to tackle the climate crisis. Yeah.
I mean, very sort of humble way of talking about what you've done and who you are, but for many young people out there, you've kind of set a pathway to show them what is possible as a young person, particularly as you say, like as a young person of colour, ethnic minority also in this great city of London and this country of England, and you built a movement, right? Like you built a movement of now hundreds of thousands of young people, mainly in this country but also internationally, who have really just said, look, as a young person, not only am I the future, but I also have a stake in our society today. And I've just been really impressed just seeing from the beginnings with your mission to now where you're going to, and now hearing about the kind of things you're doing and as a cabinet member in the local council. So it's really, really exciting. I mean, you said like a big part of your mission or how you see what you do is about trying to change the world and make things better. I mean, where does that come from? Like, so were you born and raised in Hackney?
Yeah, so I think for me it's like exactly that. It comes from a point of sort of feeling neglected as a child.
Okay.
Like feeling like your voice don't matter, like feeling powerless, like when things around you were happening and you had no control, or you felt like no one really cared about what you thought. So like when I was growing up in Hackney, a lot of the schools were shutting down, for example, between 1997 and 2003. And I had to go to a school in a neighbouring borough. I was actually one of, I think it's like more than 63% of children who had to go to neighbouring boroughs to go to school. My youth club got shut. And like for me, my youth club was more than just a youth club. It was basically my second home, because my mum used to work. And when she used to work, I used to go to school, and then from 4 o'clock to 9 o'clock, I'll spend the time at youth club, and then they'll pick me up and take me home, and I'll do that every single day for like 10 years of my life. So when my youth club got shut, I just couldn't understand why no one had cared about the fact that this, you know, this space that was a place for so many local people that existed for 30 years, no one cared about why it was shutting down. No one tried to stop it. No one thought about the alternatives for the young people in the area. So I just felt like, you know what, you can either sit and complain about these things, or, you know, I'm going to get involved and I'm going to try to be a voice for people, as I say, like, who look and sound like me. And that's why, like, really I wanted to create MyLifeMySay, which was all about coming from that place of, again, it's like that point of feeling like young people don't feel like their voices are heard. You see everything that's going on around the world, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it as well, where, you know, whether it's about Brexit, whether it's about climate change, there's so many issues that are impacting young people, and they need a voice, because, you know, everything that we decide now is going to impact their future generations. So that's why I created MyLifeMySay, was to kind of respond and give the tools to young people to be able to stand up and be counted. Yeah,
that's fascinating. Like, I actually didn't know that story, even though you know, we've known each other for time. I think like the genesis story of people's kind of journey into, in a way, public life, but also activism and want to make a difference is always fascinating to me. I mean, as I mentioned, right now I'm looking really internally, because I'm trying to write this book about kind of what it meant to be growing up as a son of immigrants in London, in a place which, as you say, has changed and always changes. And I think when you look internally, you also have to ask these big questions. So like you, when I was young, my mum was working long hours, so she'd work at night actually, because she works in the casino industry. And then my dad, who I've mentioned to you before, like passed away when I was young, and so with just my mum there, it was like my auntie taking care of me. So I think like the absence of my father was kind of made me want to kind of first off do bad stuff, because I had bad role models, but then kind of some people became mentors, kind of showed me a different way. And for you, I mean, you mentioned your mom, like, because there's a lot of young people out there who come from backgrounds like ours, who will just become, like many of my mates, like things which aren't what we've done. So I'm curious, like, for you, particularly for those most marginalised, like, kind of underrepresented youths that, I mean, we talk about underrepresented youth, but we don't actually, like, you know, those furthest away. For you, like, what was the switch from observing this, a youth club closing, but then why did you, have you really kind of looked at why you actually then stood up? Because you could have not, right? Like, have you thought about that? Like, why you decided, I'm going to take a decision to try and create something to change this?
I think it's two things. I think one of them is what you said, which is one is about role models. So I was lucky that I was at that point where I could have gone two ways. I could have completely disconnected from society, or I could have gone down the route which I'm going down now, which is trying to do something about it. And I was lucky that at the time I had a really good mentor at my school who, you know, like, I would regularly meet, and it was great because it was like, at the time we used to have like social workers who used to work at schools. So you'd see them like every week, and you just talk to them about issues at home and everything, and it's like, it wasn't like you had to have a problem, and I feel like schools don't have that now, but we did at the time. And that was, for me, like, I think if she wasn't there, I don't know if I would have kind of found the solutions to the problems I was facing, because we used to talk about it a lot. So she would make me sort of like question things, would map out what I could potentially do to help people in my community, or, you know, what job career path I want to take. And I was very lucky to have that as a young kid. And then the other thing is like, I think naturally I've always sort of, for me, it's like when people have always doubted people like us, you know, like, you probably know this, but, you know, back in the day when you used to say you're from Hackney, people used to look at you a certain type of way. Either, you know, your family's poor, or, you know, like, there's some sort of involvement in crime or whatever it is. And for me, it was like, no, I need to prove these people wrong. Like, not all of us are like this. And actually, most young people in Hackney are very talented, but they're just not given the stage to perform. So,
well, that's deep, because like this bit about like, we need to prove ourselves. So this is a big thing that I'm trying to figure out, because you know, when does that, like, I felt it's so visceral. I felt that I was just like, these people, they see me, others in a room. I mean, I remember one time I was about to give a speech in the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. I was invited there actually to speak in place of the then employment minister, because I was doing research onto youth unemployment. And then I was about to give the speech. I was preparing in my suit, ready to do business, and then some stranger comes up to me and says, "Excuse me, where's the toilet?" Because he thought I was one of the kind of helpers there. I looked like so many of my aunties, my parent, like my family, my community. That's what the kind of jobs we do, like, for sure. Yeah. And they did that because that's the jobs that were available to them, and they were, they're doing what they had to do. But what I found ridiculous was the fact that he immediately assumed, without even knowing who I am, that that's who I was. And so I felt this immediate urge to kind of prove. And so then a few minutes later, obviously I sat on the front row, and then they call my name and they say it, and then I get up on stage, and then I'm about to give my speech, take a deep breath, and I look at him and I just smile and laugh, and he obviously looks at his friend and he has a chat, and it was just like, okay, look, like, you assumed that I was somebody, but here's who I actually am. Yeah. So where does that come, like, why do you feel we need to prove, like, why do we need to prove to these people that, you know, we are more than what they assume?
Yeah, I think I don't know, like, I can see the logic of not wanting to. I do feel like there is a systematic problem where I feel like people from our backgrounds, or where we're from, you know, feel like we have to try to fit in a system that's sort of like created for us. And it's like, you know, I meet a lot of my friends, for example, who aren't happy in their jobs, but inadvertently, without even thinking about it, they would never leave their job, because the way they've been brought up is to think you take what you're given and you don't take a risk, you don't have a second chance if you fail, those sorts of things. So I think, you know, there are those systematic wider issues, but I think for me it's the drive of wanting to show people that actually, you know, there's more to, like, it's really trying to highlight some of these systematic failures that we do have in our education system, in poverty, like the injustices that we face, and showing people that if you give us the tools, like, we can do so much better. Because some of the life skills that I gain, like, I don't some people would say I'm from a disadvantaged background. Actually, I would be, on paper, I would be described as someone who's from a disadvantaged background, like, you know, free school meals, my mum's a care worker, my dad's a cab driver, he worked in, like, so many different jobs over the years, you know, like, we had it tough growing up. But for me, I would always describe myself as from a privileged background. And the reason why I say that is because some of the challenges that I faced as a young kid, I don't think that people from more privileged backgrounds have that level of exposure to make decision making at that young age. So, for example, like, we were put into so many difficult positions as a young kid where you didn't have time to think what was going wrong. You kind of had to just get through it and make a decision, right? And later on in life, what you realise, and I know this from you as well, is a lot of us are really good problem solvers because of the fact that we had to make those decisions from a very young age. Or we've always been, like, I've known you as well, like, you've always been able to work the room really well. Like, you're a great networker. You don't need to, you know, like, you're not awkward in social settings. And that's because, again, like, when you were younger, you just had to talk your way out of things, or you had to talk you through opportunities. So I feel like we come from underprivileged backgrounds in many ways, but at the same time as well, some of those experiences have given us the tools to kind of really show the world who we are.
Yeah, no, I think particularly when, for example, I look at my cousin Hector in the Philippines, who basically looks exactly like me, a bit older, a bit skinnier, and but we always used to cause trouble when we were together in the Philippines when I was young. He's never been to the UK because of visa issues, but, like, you know, just because he was born in the Philippines and I was born here, like, the privilege, like, it's ridiculous. And so I think there's so much that we should try and figure out how to solve those systematic injustices that you mentioned, but also be kind of accepting of the privilege and the opportunities we had simply by the luck of being born or raised in a place like this. I mean, for you, like let's talk a bit about that. So, obviously throughout your career, young people have also been a key part. Youth services you mentioned, kind of because you've also been a counsellor. This real sense of connection to your local neighbourhoods and community has been really key. Let's talk a bit about kind of the injustices that you see out there in the world, or have seen throughout your life, your career, and kind of had said, I want to do something about it. Because for many viewers of the school, they're trying to figure out how they kind of practically solve some of the most intractable problems our society faces, whether it be environmental damage, racism, sexism, economic inequalities, health inequities. What's the number one thing you're trying to figure out now, or throughout your career, what was the big injustice that you wanted to try and help have a dent on?
Yeah, I think for me it's definitely like sort of the economic inequality. So I
Okay.
think by virtue of the fact that like where you're born, and I guess it links with lots of the other factors like environmental, education. Like I think when we're all born, it's not like we're all born different to each other. Like we probably is what it is our society. The society kind of impacts the way your life chances go. And I think like for me it's like being from a place like Hackney or in Newham, it's like you're kind of, depending on where you're born, you're more likely to have a job that pays you lesser income. You're more likely to have less savings. Therefore, you can't take some of those risks that you want to sort of be able to do to give yourself a shot at life. You're more likely to sort of not have the skills, like the soft skills you need to kind of excel. So for me, like the economic, like I know, like firsthand where through my family where, like I know it sounds like very extreme, but like there were days where we had to literally plan our food like for the week. And then the impact that has on the well-being of your family, like living in like a 2-bed flat, for example, where, our living room was also a bedroom.
Just take me there. So how old were you here? Like, what's the house look like? You said, so 2-bedroom flat.
2-bedroom flat. My sister was born obviously in 98. So me and my brother had to stay in one room. As she got older, she had to have a separate room. And then my mum and dad lived in the living room. The implications of that is never being able to have family dinner together, because you just don't have living room space, right?
For real.
So these are the sorts of things that, like, this is why I always say to people, it's like, when you think about the economic impact, it's the other things that come with it. It's like, us as a family not being able to enjoy evening meals together. Like, we take our food, take it to the separate rooms, eat, because there's just no space to do that. So those are the sorts of things that, like, I think, and then that, that then has an impact on people not wanting to spend time at home, for example, so they want to spend more time in the streets. And then, as you say, if you get influenced by the wrong people, then there's other consequences to that. So for me, it's like one of the big things that I've always been passionate about is how do you kind of, like, I think sometimes the problem with us as human beings is we think about society or life within sort of the system that we kind of live in. And for me, it's like, how do you kind of take yourself away from that and think out the box and think about, okay, what do we want the world to look like and how do we get there? And not sort of more of the same. It's not to say like go for a complete change of the system, but it's how do you kind of improve it for people who need it. And you see it with the environment now, like the racial stuff. Like when I was younger, I didn't really understand to the extent that we were disadvantaged by the virtue of being from different ethnic minority backgrounds. But now I'm like, wow. Like when I look back, I'm like, I'm really deep, like how different it is. Like I know you, for example, like all your accomplishments and achievements, for example, like if you'd done half that, but you were to be from a different background, you probably would have been even higher. Do you know what I mean? That you have to work 3 times harder just to kind of be in those rooms. But I didn't really realise that when I was younger. I think it's something that I'm still continuously learning now.
And that's when I used to work for David Lammy, Right Honourable David Lammy, back in 2012, just after the riots. That's something he would say privately to me, but now obviously I'm telling you, but it's you just got to work twice as hard. And I think part of me thinks now we're in a world where because of Black Lives Matter, like specifically because of Black Lives Matter, but also all the other movements and the groups and organizations who've been like working away for years, decades, centuries even, and the voices who reached up, like now I'm seeing, particularly in British society, a lot of changes because of protest action. And I know that you marched alongside those who are calling for racial equality and for justice in that sense, and it's all those actions which show protest and standing up for something you believe is right can have an impact, because now I'm seeing people being recognised by getting MBEs, OBEs, being recognised by the Queen, the monarchy, the royal family, but as well as that, getting promoted. I'm seeing a lot of more people getting promoted, and also kind of because of the skin color. So I think like and now that's a whole other conversation which is fascinating. But kind of wanted to get to the point which you made just before the race, which was around the dinner table, because so many folk talk about like the fact that around a dinner table, sometimes you might not get the best food, sometimes you'll be having baked beans for like dinner, sometimes you won't have any food, as you mentioned, and sometimes it will be like, well, the conversations we're having on a dinner table might be about gossip about the other auntie around the corner, or like the gambling habit and the losses of the friend of your my stepdad, who'd be like, oh, they just lost $1,000 or like a couple £100 because they just spent the whole paycheck or their life savings on like a horse which lost, and then which then leads those people to, those members of the community, like spiral into like alcoholism and all the other kind of personal problem issues. But like your bit about not having a dinner table, like that's sort of such a powerful kind of fact, which I don't think many folk realise is the case, because on the one hand you talk about the world at which we want to see, because having now got to places and been in rooms that you and I have been able to get into and to work and to be a part of and to contribute to, you see another world where actually the dinner table is luxurious, like the finest stuff. Sometimes it's so casual because they passed the stage of luxury. They're like, oh, I'm kind of bored of like the finest wines and the finest kind of cutlery, now let's just go casual, but spending more to look casual, if that makes sense. So now that we are, you are dining at these bigger tables, I mean, how do we, is that the kind of world you want to build for folk who don't necessarily in the beginning didn't have it? Like, what is the vision for a more economically equal society in your view, before we get to kind of like how you practically try to help achieve that?
Yeah, for me it's about like, it's about giving everyone an equal chance at life. Like, it's about, being able to make decisions without feeling like of the 50 consequences that will come with it. Like some people could take, I see like some great entrepreneurs, for example, who, you don't take nothing away from them. They've gone on to create fantastic ideas, but they've had the luxury of knowing that if something went wrong, they've got something to fall back on, because of their family's financial well-being, or they may not have to necessarily worry about paying the mortgage or the rent or whatever. Like, there are so many things come into that. I think if you're not that well off, or if you don't have that sort of that buffer to fall back on, you can't really take that risk, because you know that you stand more to lose. So for me, it's more about, when I think about creating a much more just society, it's more about giving everyone the opportunity. It's not to say that everyone needs to be equal in terms of everyone has the same wage or anything like that. It's more about giving everyone the same opportunity to give a go at life, and like, if you want to, and not have to worry about those very basic things that should be normal, which is like having a family dinner, or like thinking about, if I make this investment into like stocks and shares this month, if I lose a bit of money, I'm not going to have to worry about, like, it's about giving that financial freedom so people can actually think and aspire to do better things, rather than just sort of feeling like you're just going through the motion of ticking through life, like very robotic, let's get through, have kids, make sure they get education, and you get on. And it's like the same cycle for people, you know? How do you reimagine like what the world looks like?
Let's get a bit into that, because I think sometimes when particularly policymakers or people talk about the economy, discuss these kinds of things, it skims across the real practical nature of it. But what was interesting is how you mentioned very practical things like, okay, where do you have investments?
Yeah.
And this isn't a personal finance channel, but what kind of questions are we asking within the household, where it's like, have you invested in crypto, but do you even know what crypto is? What are the risks here? Is it better to invest your savings like $1,000 in a year in S&P 500, which will go up right now in the year by like 25% or on average 12% a year, rather than a 1% savings account, which means due to inflation you have less? And I'm able to talk about this in a way because I've investigated it and learned a lot about it through later life and being an adult and having conversations with people who do this on a regular basis. But many folk won't have that ability to speak with, a financial advisor, somebody who's an accountant, somebody who because of the work we do are just part of our network. So in a way, our ability to have economic capital is reflected by our social capital and who our networks are. How do we practically how is that something we can practically do with our everyday households, the households that we grow up in?
So I think what needs to happen is you need to have a much more, like when we go to school, for example, like you learn about periodic tables, right? Stuff that you're never really going to apply to your day-to-day life when you think about it. Not to say periodic tables and science don't matter, but what you should be learning is how do you negotiate your pay at work? How do you, I don't know if you noticed, but most of us, when we get a job, you don't even negotiate your pay. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, we're scared to negotiate your pay or negotiate a promotion, or how do you, like, critical thinking, exactly like you said, like having conversations with young people about like investments, smart investments, all of these things. What does risk look like? Did that look like? Voting, why is it important to vote? Like real life things that you're gonna need. And it's almost like you get to the age of 20 and you haven't learned none of that, and then you're having to learn it all, and that's the problem we live in. I think that's not gonna happen, if I'm honest with you. Like, I don't think we're gonna get that institutional educational change that needs to reflect that, for a whole lot of other reasons. But I think what can happen is conversations like this. So through like what you're doing, for example, if you can get people on here who could talk to, educate young people around different aspects of life, whether it's financial, mental, physical, all of these different aspects of people's life. Like, I always break my life into 5 different areas. I always say, how am I going to improve myself this year financially, my mental well-being, my physical well-being, my career, and then my family and friendships as well. So if you kind of like, get people who can give good, solid, practical advice around these 5 areas and like really disseminate. But what we need to do is, how do you get through to, like, as you said, like the aunties, the auntie WhatsApp groups, because those are the ones who have a big influence on children who grow up, But I think, we need to like think about, not wait for it to come. We need to go out there and make it happen.
Those 5 areas are interesting because one of the other folk that I was fortunate to have a conversation with, a guy called Chris. He's a boxer, but also he does a lot of non-profit work. And of course, I had also another conversation with someone who's an activist, who's worked on advise and help so many other activists on issues around democracy. And 2 of the things they mentioned are, first of all, Chris around physical health, and then Teresa around mental health. Because first off, like, particularly people who are like trying to address these big social problems, how the hell how do you address economic inequality? How do you address like climate change? Kind of bring it down to also yourself as an individual and making sure you take care of yourself. So I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I after last year, like, I lost like 15 kilograms because I decided I'm too overweight, I'm eating unhealthily, and I'm not exercising enough. And then suddenly, like, I was just like, one day I was like, look, I'm going to stop that. I lost 15 kilograms, took a whole bunch of different like ways to lose weight. And also that means, as somebody in the public space now, I feel a lot more healthier. I am healthier and able to contribute. Now, obviously, there's all these diet programs and all that kind of stuff out there. But do you think, like, is that important? Like, when you mentioned the third bit around physical and the second bit about mental, how do you approach that as someone who's quite active and busy?
Yeah, so I think since lockdown, I started doing a lot of running, a lot more walking. I think people underrate walking a lot.
Yeah.
Like getting your steps in, not eating as much from outside, all of those things, and it kind of links together, because if you're not looking after yourself physically, then mentally you're not going to feel good, and you also I'm no expert in terms of, not a food expert, but I do know that there are like certain foods that activate some of your brain cells, and some of them which kind of make you feel more tired and sluggish, etc. So it's like your food and diet is very important, and the way you look after yourself is make sure you get good sleep, all of those sorts of things. So for me, it's like it's really important that you do take care. Like, this is your car, your engine, right? Like, if you don't look after it, like, how on earth are you going to be able to, because your body is all energies, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. One of the big roles you've played over the last few years is being a counsellor. Being a counsellor is one of those roles in British society which is so important in terms of a political role which is really wedded to the lives of everyday people. You have people come to you on a regular basis, on your kind of times when you have your opening hours to talk, for them to talk to you about the issues locally. I mean, as a counsellor, can you give an example of a real form of change you and your colleagues together have achieved? And then it'll be great to kind of learn a bit about the practicalities of how you did it, like how it started, what was the problem, how did you first try and solve it, and what were the challenges, what didn't go well, and then in the end what was achieved, and what your lessons from that. But great to hear a story.
So I'll give you an example. So I represent Stoke Newington. I'm also the cabinet member for transport in Hackney, and so it's my job in Hackney to make sure that everyone breathes clean air. Okay, and we know that we've got a huge air pollution crisis in London, especially in Hackney. Hackney's got one of the worst air quality in the whole of London. 7% of people in Hackney die related to air pollution related health associated risk with air pollution.
Wow.
And so one of our roads, for example, one of our areas specifically, the nitrogen dioxide levels are 30% above what the World Health Organization's targets are on their limits, basically, on particulate matter. So that's a big problem for us, and we know that a quarter of our carbon dioxide emissions in Hackney come from cars. So we knew, first started because there was a school who was on that road, which got more than 10,000 cars that drive through that road every single day, and there was just 3 schools on that street, and they've been campaigning for years, basically saying, look, like, I'm sending my kids to school, but they've got stunted lungs, they've got asthma, and it's all because, the air pollution is super bad. Like, what are you doing as a council? And they've been campaigning for years, so we kind of went through that motion, and in the end, what we done was we designed a sort of a low traffic neighbourhood, what we call a low traffic neighbourhood, which is basically designed to tackle toxic air pollution, reduce car usage, but also reimagine what the public realm looks like in the area. So we finally managed to get a low traffic neighbourhood scheme into Stoke Newington, which had a lot of loops that we had to go through, which some of it was about getting funding from TfL, some of it was about it takes time because you've got to have a consultation. The traffic engineers need to design how the displacement of traffic will look like, because what a low traffic neighbourhood does is it sort of you still have access to the road, but it restricts through access. So basically, like, if you're driving through a road, there'll be cameras either side halfway through the road, and you can't get to the other side. If you drive through it, you'll get a ticket. So what you'll have to do is you have to go around the zone. So it's basically like a clean air zone. That's the way you got to think of it. And so the aim is to improve air quality drastically. It's a very drastic measure. And for me, that's something that I'm incredibly proud of, because it now means that thousands of kids who both study and live in the area are going to breathe cleaner air. It means that we can really think about what the public realm looks like, the street trees, getting al fresco dining for some of our businesses, just really thinking about how that could be a new pedestrianised, very nice area also helps bus users. So buses can use it.
Okay.
So buses and emergency vehicles are the only exception, because emergency vehicles, they might need to obviously respond to emergencies, and it helps buses in terms of like the speed time, because now it means that if you're using a bus on that route, you're gonna get from A to B like probably 5-10 minutes quicker than what you would have before, because the road is literally empty other than other buses. So that's something that for me, like, I'm really, really proud of, and it's something that I was able to do actually this summer.
Okay.
And it literally happened, and overnight it was like the whole area just completely transformed. And for me it was like, that's why you get into politics, because literally within 24 hours you just change something that's going to impact people for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's a great story, and I think, like, as you put it, you literally changed with, people involved, changed the world, in this case in in Hackney. I think one of the reasons why I find that story so compelling is because climate change, environmental damage, huge, intractable global problems of which we need to address. And to then really think about how on a local level we can try and address what is being caused by, in this case particularly cars, and how to protect literally the lungs of children, so that they don't have health problems, or potentially even have a 7% risk of death. There's this idea of what do you call it, low
Traffic neighbourhoods.
Low traffic neighbourhoods, to really address that. I mean, can you talk us through some of the challenges you face? Because I can imagine one of the challenges would be, well, first off, local businesses, they might actually want cars to come through because they want, they might say they're going to lose footfall, business will go lower, and therefore they lose revenue. The other thing would be, well, this is just, you're going around, so therefore you're pushing the cars elsewhere, which means you're pushing the problem, otherwise. The other criticism could be, well, is this the best solution for what we're trying to do? Because I think a lot of people who are kind of listening would want to figure out, well, first off, how did you decide with your team this was the best kind of thing? How did you work with the schools and the parents and the teachers and the children who were trying to make this happen? And also, how did you respond to, because I think one thing that people need to always realize is that once you put something forward, there will always be someone who would not want that change to happen. Yeah. So let's talk through the real practicalities of how you achieve this change and kind of some of the hurdles you faced.
Yeah, so all of those challenges you mentioned, those are all very real life challenges. So just like this week, I'm still continuing to have meetings with businesses to try to understand how the scheme is impacting their businesses. I think part of it is about making sure that you've got really good monitoring and capturing data. So both in terms of air quality, not just within the zone, but also on the boundary roads. Looking at the traffic counts on the boundary roads, so trying to look at displacement. What usually happens in transport terms is when you restrict a road like that, usually a third of traffic goes north, a third goes south, and a third will eventually evaporate. Because the reason why is because, especially in the case of Hackney, is some people who drive short trips may start to kind of just walk it or cycle or take bus. So they might drive, they'll still drive, but they'll drive less frequently. So you won't drive to the shop round the corner. You might just think, well, I'm just going to walk it this time. The other thing is, a lot of the cars we know that more than 83% of cars in Hackney, that take vehicle trips in Hackney, are vehicles registered outside of the borough. And we know that through all of our traffic filter cameras, working with DVLA, and more than 40% is actually outside London. So we're quite because we're quite central to Islington, North London, East London, Central London, everyone's driving through Hackney to get to where they need to go. So what will happen is eventually is that you'll start to see some traffic evaporate because those cars won't come through the area no more, because it's no longer a desirable route for them to take, because they're going to probably spend more time going around. So they'll probably either take the train into the central London rather than driving from Ilford to central London, because before Hackney was the route, whereas if Hackney is now going to be busy for them, they might just be like, well, I'll just stick to the train. So those are all very real concerns. I think what you need to do is you need to be ready to kind of be flexible in your decision. And what I mean by that is it's like you don't want to be stubborn in your approach. Like you're not going to get 100% right because it's such a transformative change. There's going to be things that you haven't thought of. So when we first started doing low traffic neighbourhoods in Hackney, which was 2020, I wasn't the cabinet member at the time. I became the cabinet member this year. But at the time, we didn't give blue badge exemption. So when I came in, for example, one of the first things I done was give exemption to blue badge holders, people with disabilities who may need who need to drive to get to where they need to. So I think you need to be flexible. Like we're supporting our businesses in Stoke Newington around a marketing campaign called See You in Stokey. So like trying to support them in different ways. So I think you need to be honest with people as well, like about the reasons why you're doing it and it's why you've come to the decision you have. But look, there's no ultimately easy, like you say, that you're going to get people who really love you for it, people who really hate you for it. And then there'll be people who, you know, but you don't want to pick a side. Like I'm not there to serve only the people who love it. I'm there to serve the people who hate it as well. And I need to find ways where I might not fully be able to win those people over, but how can I make it, do it the best possible way where, you know, we reduce the impact on their lives and livelihoods. And I think, like, you know, on the Stoke Newington scheme specifically, I think, like, we don't have much, like, I think it's gone down pretty well because we had, like, when we announced the scheme, from when we announced it to when we actually went to implementation, we had 37 public meetings within 6 weeks. And that was, like, speaking to loads of different communities, businesses, and just trying to understand what can we do around, like, the signage, the sat-nav apps, the traffic signalling, the parking spaces, the pavements, the public realm, all of that. And, you know, trying to do it in the best possible way. But look, inevitably, like, that's politics, isn't it? You're not going to get everyone who's going to be happy with the decision, but you need to decide why you got into politics. The easy thing for me to do would be to be presented with a problem that we have around air quality and be like, do you know what? I don't want a headache. Let's just keep things ticking as it is, like status quo. Or you get into it because you're trying to make a difference for people, and that's the route I took. I didn't want to just keep things ticking. I wanted to do something different. Otherwise, why am I in politics? You might as well give it up for someone else who actually wants to do something.
Let's talk a bit about that. So your role as a politician, you know, you've given an example of the power and possibility of what you can do as a politician, as a councillor, with kind of a brief at cabinet level in a borough. On decision making, because of course there's a lot of people out there who are trying to figure out, you know, how to make decisions, and less on the kind of macro scale, but sort of you're in your office or you're in your having dinner and you're trying to decide how do I do things, because of course the role of a politician is to represent your constituents, but also to make decisions in which you believe represent the interests of those people and will lead to a better outcome and result. How do you make decisions? Do you have do you have a piece of paper and you're like, here are the pros and cons? Do you have like a mental model which you use? Do you go to certain people for advice? Do you look at history? Like, when you've got a big decision to make, whether it's like, do I choose to have this headache and try and create this change, or do I work on this problem rather than that problem? What, you know, can you share some ways in which you make decisions?
Yeah, so I think there's not one way. I think there's a lot of things you mentioned that are within that. So like making sure you got a close group of people who you always go to like for their advice in the council in terms of like, you know, the decision making process you're doing, making sure you're engaging with all the different types of people who think have a different opinion on what you're about to do. I think that's really important because you need to hear all the sides before you go ahead and make a decision. But ultimately, look, your job as a politician, as a leader, is you're not a messenger, right? You're there to lead, and your job as a leader is to push forward based on the mandate of what you've been elected to do, and to take people on that journey with you. So sometimes I say like there are people who may have disagreed with certain policies that I may have carried out at the start, but eventually they've really bought into the idea, because it doesn't just stop, the engagement doesn't just stop at the point at which you make the decision. You need to continue engaging with those people to try to get them to understand, because no one's going to really like short-term change. Like, most people I mean, there's like survey polls around it as well, like especially in the UK, like people don't like change too much. People like things as it is. So, you know, when I'm trying to tell you how you should live your life or whatever, it's like you don't want to be, and that's understandable. So it's our human nature. So we need to like work with them in a way that doesn't shame them or doesn't sort of push them to the other side, to try to understand their concerns, get them to understand where we're coming from, and then you make that decision. But look, ultimately, I think one of the problems we have in politics now is it's very reactive. I think we've got a lot of leaders now that kind of react to day-to-day social media, tweets and just public pressure. Like they're scared to make decisions. I think gone are the days of when you had like people who make a decision, who are firm with the decision, can explain to the public why they think this decision is right, and he's not going to be scared by, you know, just the loudness of Twitter for that day because they may be trending number one. Like, and I think that's a real problem. It's like, how many politicians can you say out there right now as leaders, can you say like has a real vision for the world? I mean, for the country or for the community. It's like, what's your 5-year, 10-year plan? I don't think we've got a lot of people who could do that. I think people just go sort of day to day. And that's a real problem. You need like visionaries in politics, and you need to be firm with your decision, and I think people respect that. So in a weird way, like with like Boris, for example, sometimes, you know, when you're like, how does he get away with all of these scandals and stuff like that? I think it's because he just kind of like, in a weird way, he just kind of says, well, this is me, accept me who I am, and if you don't like it, then you don't like it. I mean, that's a very extreme approach, but how do you kind of like communicate with people in a way which kind of explains to people the thought process behind your decision making, and, you know, just be nice about it. Don't do it in a way that's going to be like obviously push people away.
Political leadership throughout British history, from how it was, how it is now, and how it could be in the future. How do you, given all of your experience in kind of working with young people who are aspirational and want to do good and want to volunteer and contribute to the community, you know, how would you portray what good political leadership looks like? Or not even political leadership, like for many people who are joining or listening into the school, they want to learn, well, I'm really angry about this problem that, you know, that they might have, or they see, they want to do something, and of course part of that is the leadership of bringing people with you, as you mentioned. Like, how do you become a leader? Because some people say some people are just born leaders, and you can't learn it, or you can't become a leader. Like, what is your view or vision of an ideal leader, political leader, and how do we bring people to reach that kind of ideal?
I think it's the values that you have. Like, I think as a leader, it's very difficult to have the answers to every issue in your community or in your country. Like, you're not an expert. I don't think you're expected to be an expert. I think what you're expected is to have the right values that guide your decision making. So, do you have integrity? Are you compassionate? Do you have empathy? Like, these are the sorts of things that I think people look for, and I think, you know, that's what we're kind of missing right now with some of our leaders. You know, like when you look at, I mean, I don't want to get too political, but, you know, when you look at, for example, like the current Prime Minister of Britain, you know, all of those things that I mentioned, it's missing.
You mentioned kind of values being a big part. Like,
yeah.
How does one uncover your values? Or, you know, because, for example, I remember being part of the Uprising Leadership Programme, which was a leadership programme set up by Rushanara Ali, the current MP for Bethnal Green and Bow, alongside many others, including Jeff Morgan at the Young Foundation, and a great founding team. And in them kind of trying to develop young leaders between the ages of 1925, you know, as a participant in the first programme, they asked us to write down what we believe our values are. So these big ideas and real things which guide decision making, as you mentioned, compassion, empathy. How does one, if nobody has ever really thought about what are my values, what do you suggest to them as to how they discover them or figure out how to live by positive values?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Which maybe you can help me find the right answer.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's a hard one, because it's sort of like you've got to, sometimes you know, particularly if you've never thought about it, you've got to write them down, right?
Exactly.
You've got to know what do values mean, and sometimes you might even know what the definition of vision is, right? Like as you discussed before, like having a 5 to 10 year vision. Like one question is how do you actually plan that or create it? So I think like the very practical tools of investigation about these terms and descriptions, because sometimes a word can lead you down a pathway of discovery. Like when I asked my little cousin, it was not even my cousin, but my very close friend's son, his name's Romeo, he's such a little kid. I remember asking him at 5 years old, like, do you want to go to Harvard? Now I don't expect him to answer that question or expect him to even go to Harvard. I want to go to Harvard. But the use of the word Harvard now means that in his understanding of the world, there is a place that is Harvard, and it's the best academic institution. And so like vision and values, for people who've never really interrogated that, maybe that's the start, right? Because I think a lot of the bits about being an amateur or new kind of advocate or activist or person with ambitions to lead and address social problems, it's sort of like you've got a blank page, you don't really know what to do, and you need to figure that out. So I think there's a lot of looking internally, but also being prompted by mentors and people with experience to look down certain pathways and words. I mean,
and it's that self-discovery, isn't it? Like I think one of the problems we don't do enough of is exactly trying to discover who we are as individuals, and I don't think there's any pressure for you to find out, you know. I think there's a lot of pressure on young people particularly to kind of know what they need to do in life in their 20s, or to understand who they are as a human being, but you're continuously developing, learning. But I think one of the things we don't do is, like you say, is sit and reflect and think about our purpose in life. What are we trying to achieve? Where do I want to go to? Some of that is because some people don't have the time to reflect because of their, you know, their living standards or whatever it may be. And some of it is just because, you know, people may be occupied doing lots of different things that are just keeping us distracted from that. But we definitely, like, it's really important, because I know, like, for example, in my role as a cabinet member, I'm not an expert on energy. I'm also not an expert on waste, right? I'm not an expert on transport by profession. I'm not an expert public realm by profession. I'm not an expert in none of those things. Like, I know about those things, but I wouldn't say, you know, I don't have a PhD, or I don't know to the T, like, what you need to do. But what I do know is that when I consume information from my experts in that field, I can make decisions based on those values that guide me, and I always stand by them, which is I know that I always know. And, you know, other people, like your mayor, or, you know, like in my case, obviously my mayor who appointed me to the role, he's appointed me not because he thinks I'm the most knowledgeable on energy. He's appointed me because he knows that when I have to make a decision, that I've got the right values and those right values that are going to help me make a healthy decision based on the information that I receive. So I think we definitely need to do much more around, like, self-discovery. If you don't have that level of, like, if you haven't never thought about these things.
Yeah, and I guess, like, the role of a politician, as you say, is not to be an expert. Like in any business, right, you have your CEO whose main role in a startup is to create a business that works. But also part of that is involving and creating a team where you might have a technical expert who's the coder developer to create if it's a tech business website, and you don't, as a CEO, expect to learn or know code, but also you might need a domain expert who's, if you're in health tech, a doctor, or somebody, as you say, has a PhD in a particular field within you know, the medical world. So I think the role of politician, as you mentioned very clearly, is like bringing these people together, understanding their interests, and in the end making a decision which kind of works best for your constituency. I mean, for you, like, before we close, I've got this question and one final one. What is the biggest challenge that you're trying to overcome now, aside from the work you've been doing with pollution and a low traffic neighbourhood? What is a major challenge of which you're trying to kind of overcome now?
Yeah, so for me, one of the key things that I'm trying to overcome is, you know, we've seen this coming out of COP26 as well, which is there's a whole big drive to push towards, you know, a greener economy. You know, people often talk about, you know, tackling the climate crisis, but for me it's like, let's flip it slightly, which is tackling the climate crisis to save our planet is very important. Of course, that's the main goal. But also, how do you excite communities who traditionally don't engage in this debate around, you know, what a green dividend looks like for them? So when we say green jobs, what does green jobs mean for them at a local level? How do you kind of define that practically? So is it, for example, that you might get jobs that kind of installing solar energy, maybe creating businesses out of that? So let's define what greener jobs look like. Thinking about, for example, you know, lower energy bills. So we know fuel poverty, obviously it's a big thing, particularly within working class communities. So why is it that a transition to a greener economy actually is better for people from working class communities? Because they're more likely to save money on their energy bills, their food prices, thinking about the clean air aspect of it, again, which I was talking about, the transport related stuff. So for me, it's about how do you kind of, the key challenge for me now is how do you kind of take this very high level conversation coming out of COP and relate it to communities in Hackney, when a lot of them would see it as an issue that doesn't really directly relate to them, because we haven't been educated about climate literacy. So for them it's like, why do I, you know, for them they would see it as more of like a middle class issue, whereas actually climate change disproportionately impacts their day-to-day lives, right? Through all the things that I've just mentioned. But it's how do you kind of, you know, excite people about that transition to a greener economy and make sure that they catch on to it before it's too late, to the point where, well, it won't be too late, but it will get to the point where they've kind of missed the bit where they can benefit from most, right? Because over the next 5-10 years, there's going to be so many like advanced technologies that are going to be developed out, like green technologies, so many businesses that are going to be created, so many green entrepreneurs that are going to emerge out of these things. I mean, I was talking about solar energy installation in Hackney with my officers, and like the number of qualified technicians in this area is so low. So that's an area, for example, imagine you just trained like hundreds of young people, they're sorted for like the next 20, 40, 30 years of their life, because they're going to have a job that has got a lifeline and a sustainable job. So how do you kind of like get them onto that so that they benefit from it very quickly? So that's for me the biggest challenge now is how do you kind of shift the conversation away from just, you know, this is something we need to do, which obviously it is, to the point where this is something that we want to do. Because otherwise, you know, when you talk about climate change, it's like you think some of the biggest emissions in our life are, it's about how you dress, right? Fast fashion is obviously a big issue. How we eat, we know that we need to reduce our consumption levels. We know we need to think about the way we move around in society, because whether it's taking planes, driving, etc. So we all have to make very difficult decisions over the next 10-15 years. But if I come and say to you, Alvin, I don't really think you should be travelling much or taking a plane, you're not going to really take that well, are you? Or if I say to you, I don't think you should buy nice clothes or whatever, you're not going to really take that well. So it's more about how do I kind of like, rather than seeming to be kind of restricting your way of life, how do I kind of like paint a picture that you want to aspire to get to, if that makes sense? So it's kind of flipping it the other way around.
I think what for me is quite fascinating about this conversation is that it's a conversation which I didn't think it would be centered upon, because of your kind of day-to-day now with your new role on a cabinet, really focus on the environment and how it impacts the local constituents in Hackney. But I think for me that's quite telling, because I think one of the facets of leadership is being able to, you know, take on problems which are new. So a lot of people who are entering this world of sort of social justice will be thinking, there's so many problems out there, which one do I address? And the point is that in a lifetime, you know, some people dedicate their whole life, and some people even die for a cause, and we know all the famous names of people who did. And it's like, then how do you choose, and then how do you become knowledgeable about these things? I think your example right now is one where you can transition from, say, for example, the youth issues and the economic inequality we discussed in the beginning, to now these other problems which you're learning about but also have to make decisions on. With that in mind, the fact that you've also, which we haven't really talked about, started and run and built an organisation for young people, do you have any kind of tips? So for example, like if I just start, or in 10 years time, 15 years time, someone's watching this and they're like, oh, I wonder what Mete would advise me to do because I can't speak to him because he's doing something else, or like, you know, there's
Yeah.
hopefully millions of people, or 100,000 people, thousands of people watching this. What advice would you give to them in starting their journey, but also in trying to create the change they want to see in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think for me it's all about, I think sometimes the problem is we try to find a perfect solution to a problem, and that solution doesn't necessarily exist straight away. You need to, there's a whole process of learning. So I often speak to a lot of like young, you know, aspiring entrepreneurs or social entrepreneurs who want to create, you know, like really fantastic initiative, and they've got a really good idea, but it's almost like they stall the launch of what they want to do because they're trying to get everything ready. And I always say to people, just go with it, start it, and you'll figure it out and you'll learn. And the reason why I say that is because like when I first started MyLifeMySay to what it is now, the fundamentals are still the same in terms of what the aims and the ambitions are, but the delivery mechanism, the business model, everything is completely different. Because it's, how am I meant to know that before I start? I need to kind of like get with it, go, learn, listen, have mentors, and you know, you evolve throughout the process. So I think sometimes the problem is we're scared to learn, and that process of like learning and development and evolving is something that we kind of shy away from, but we shouldn't be afraid of that. So what I would say to people is, if you've got a solution to something, go for it. And then the other thing is, what I would say to people is, you don't always have to have a new idea. It's how do you take an idea and really develop it even further. So I always give the example of like Uber Eats and Deliveroo, right? So the guy who founded Deliveroo said he used to work in the city, and when Uber Eats was founded, he was really happy because he used to before work very late nights. He's working in finance. Used to go to like get a sandwich, and he didn't like cold food. So when Just Eat started, he would order hot food from Just Eat. But then he said he realised two immediate problems. One was that you didn't recognise a lot of the restaurants on Just Eat, and two was you couldn't really tell how long your driver was going to be because you just didn't have the app, didn't show you where the driver was. So he created Deliveroo on the same concept and introduced two things. One was the GPS, where you can actually see how far your delivery driver is, and the other thing was obviously getting much more recognisable restaurants on there so that you can order what you want. It's really important that you kind of, you know, when you look at the market, it's not really about trying to create a new idea all the time. It's about looking at what's already out there, identifying what the gaps are, and what you can do really well to fill in those gaps. So rather than trying to have an answer to everything, again, follow like the Apple model, for example, where, you know, when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he said, you know what, we're going to scrap all of these different products, we're going to do 3 things, but we're going to do it really well, and we're going to be the best in the market for it. So that's why I always say, like with MyLifeMySay, there's a whole lot of other ideas that we can potentially explore, but what I've always made sure with MyLifeMySay is the pie is big enough the pizza is big enough for everyone to eat from. What I wanted to make sure with MyLifeMySay is that when you think about democratic engagement, the first thing you think about is MyLifeMySay. When you think about so it's about how do you be really good at what you do, rather than doing everything, but you're not really sort of the best at everything. You're just kind of doing everything. So really focus on what value you can bring to the table and just be the best at doing that.
Amazing. And just for you to get to this point with MyLifeMySay, what was you mentioned, you know, how the business model was changed because the world changes, new opportunities come about. Like, what were some of the obstacles in reaching where you are now, and how did you kind of like respond to those?
Yeah, some of the obstacles, you know, namely financial.
Okay.
You know, like when you're starting as kind of an organisation that way, you've got to really prove to people, you know, that it's worth investing in terms of its social value and its impact. So, you know, at first it was very much kind of going 3 months, 6 months, if that. So that was a big challenge, but you know, I think once you kind of break through that, you just got to make sure that the other challenge is not just about getting the initial pot of funding, but it's about how do you maintain that level, because the funding world is a very small world and word gets around. So you want to make sure that you really take time to nurture your relationships, focus on quality rather than just trying to get 10, 50, 20 different funders. Like, if focus on a small group of funders, make sure you kind of like you're able to, demonstrate to them that you're worth that to be continue investing in. So I think that's the other thing that we don't often do, which is we don't often value the time we spend with our partners and on our relationships. That's really important. So the financial one was a big one. The other one was I'm a Labour politician. So MyLifeMySay is a non-partisan organisation. So at first, you may remember this as well, like lots of people would automatically assume, well, how could MyLifeMySay be non-partisan if Mete is a Labour politician? But again, that comes with like the credibility of years of showing that actually you're able to distinguish those two things. So over time, what I found is that people now know, or people can now distinguish that when I'm working for MyLifeMySay, I never interfere Labour with that, and then when I'm doing my Labour, I don't interfere MyLifeMySay with that. So time again gives it that. And then the other key challenge, I guess the big one, was really like there wasn't anything like MyLifeMySay existed before, in the sense that there was one or two other organisations where their core focus was democratic engagement that may have had funding, but there were lots of campaigns and volunteer that was similar. But how do you kind of create a business model that didn't exist before in the UK? And there isn't a lot of funding for this work. So I had to spend a lot of time doing that, and it's been 9-10 years now. So
wow,
yeah.
Well, I look forward to the 10-year celebration and party.
Yeah.
Before you go, you obviously mentioned earlier that a big part of how you make decisions is turning to your mentors and a close community of people. Has there been any sort of phrase or piece of advice that has stuck with you that you've used or turned to very often? So, for example, I remember first time I ever met Sadiq, who of course you work with closely. He said to me, because I was applying to do a master's and I just sent my applications out, and it was like, depending on how these go, it will shape my life in one way or the other. And he just said, look, in his very kind of like solicitor way, this was before he was mayor, it's like, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Now that's a standard phrase, but coming from him, it meant that this is a way that he sees the world, where it's like he's making a decision, he's hoping for the best, praying for the worst, but you just have to make decisions and try. Are there any sort of phrases or ideas or kind of pieces of advice that really stuck with you, which you'd like to share with folk?
It's going to sound so basic what I'm going to say, but it's so powerful. Is like one of my mentors, we're quite similar in the sense that like I'm a doer, like I don't like to ponder on things too much, and he always just says to me like, just get on and just do it, like stop talking about it, just do it. If you're going to do it. And that for me is really important, because it's like, it sounds basic, but it's like, actually I think the problem with society a lot of the time is that we talk about problems too much and we don't do enough to solve those problems. So it's like the thinking is important, but what actions are you taking to solve those problems? And sometimes you're not going to find the answers to the thinking without taking actions, because you need to try things to understand what those problems are that will help your thinking around that. So for me, it's like, I get really frustrated, for example, when I go to conferences, and I've had to like learn over the years to kind of like, understand what the role of conferences are, because when I was younger, when I used to go into it,
you're talking about political party conferences?
Not political party conferences, but like as in, when you go to like events, just general events to talk about politics or whatever it may be, and you go to, you've done a lot of travelling around the world, like I've done it as well, and you talk about, democracy, you talk about democratic engagement, you talk about, tackling economic inequality, all of these things, and it's like, everyone leaves it feeling good, and it's like, well, what are we actually doing for the person who's outside these walls who actually need us? And for me, it's like, how do you combine that social action together with the thinking? So for me, like the best piece of advice, honestly, and it's always helped me in everything, it's like, whenever I think about, should I go for this position, or should I apply for that, or whatever, and then I always just think in the back of my head, it's always like, his advice was always, just do it, you've got nothing to lose, just do it, and worst case, you're going to come back to the same position which we're in, which you didn't have it anyway.
that's a great way to end, and hopefully this is the first conversation on camera of many, because I'm sure in a few years' time there'll be a whole bunch of changes and new things you're working on and new lessons that you're able to share. So thank you, bro. Thank you, Mete. This has been a proper fun chat, insightful. I've learned new things about you, and just wish you the best with everything you're doing, and look forward to seeing where you go next. Keep on inspiring.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Alright, take care. Thank you so much to all of you who have become monthly supporters of the School of Social Justice. Your monthly contributions make a huge difference and allow us to deliver content which is educational and teaches people how to make a difference. If you want to become a patron as well, it's really simple. All you got to do is go to the schoolofsocialjustice.com website, then click supporters, and choose how much you want to contribute, whether it be £20 a month, a £5 a month, or a £10 a month. Let's go with a £10 a month. It's really simple. Put in your details, put in your card number, click pay now, and you become a supporter. Whilst £5 a month is not much individually, it makes a huge difference collectively. And if we get 2,000 patrons, we can independently deliver content to you every single week to help ensure that we fulfill this mission of training the next generation of Martin Luther Kings. Thank you so much to all of you who have become patrons so far. You've made a huge difference and allowed us to continue with our work. And if you do become a patron, thank you so much. Your support means a lot. Take care. Bye.